G'day, welcome to another episode of A Pirate in Chains, the story of convict number 6071, James Jimmy Harrison, my great-great-great-grandfather. Today we're here again back at the Cascades on the Tasman Peninsula in the little hamlet of Koonya. And I really like to express my gratitude to Don and Sue Clark and their son Marcus for allowing me access to the property to shoot the scenes for this video, because as I mentioned in the previous episode, the Cascades is now private property. It used to be really charming colonial accommodation, but now they focus on their farming, and it's not normally accessible to people. They're very concerned about protecting the heritage of this place, but they are open to genuine historians. So yeah, really great. Thanks to Don, Sue and Marcus for arranging this. The Cascades opened in 1841 as one of the new probation stations here on the Tasman Peninsula. At its peak it held over 450 convicts. And the main activities that those convicts were engaged with were growing vegetables for the wider convict market and also for the felling of timber. And this was the number one primary timber felling operation on the Tasman Peninsula, with the timber being shipped out from the jetty, which we'll come to soon. On the 25th of November 1848, Jimmy arrived here from Southport, where he'd been all those episodes of Absconding. And little did he know that just under a year later would be the most tumultuous event in his convict history so far. So this is the cell block here at the Cascades. The individual cells have gone now, but you can see where they've been. You can see the cell wall here, and the individual ventilation which came in over the top of the floor here, a wooden floor, and then ventilation back out the bottom of the floor. Jimmy had been here at the Cascades for 5 months without any issue, until on the 11th of April 1849 he absconded again. This time it was serious enough to be gazetted in the Hobart Town Gazette. And a 10-shilling reward was offered for his capture, which happened shortly later. Two months after release from solitary, he was AWOL on the 14th of July, and as a result received an additional 6 months hard labour added to his sentence. It was recommended that he be sent for 2 months separate treatment, and that could not have been at the model prison, separate prison in Port Arthur, because that wasn't completed until 1852. So in fact, it was right here. It wasn't separate treatment like the entire separate prison, but in fact it was one of the dumb cells. On the 27th of September, while working in the timber industry here at the Cascades, James was charged with misconduct for letting one of the railway carts run away. Now this is not one of them behind us, but you can imagine something of a roundabout that size, fully laden with timber. And so I'm actually thinking that this is one of the few punishments that he actually deserved, certainly on a workplace health and safety issue. Because you can imagine the carnage that a fully laden railway cart with about a tonne of timber would cause, running from the hills above all the way down here. As a result of that, he had his sentence extended by 2 months. Now, Dad's history makes a major mistake with dates here, and to be honest, I actually repeat that mistake in a couple of upcoming scenes, but I've corrected it with the captions. Because Dad's history says that these events occurred in September, but in reality they occurred in November, commencing on 9 November 1849, a day in the Harrison family which will live on in infamy, and potentially in another Tasmanian family too. So on the morning of the 9th of November, the packet ship Swan River, which used to transport people and goods to and from the station, lay tied up alongside the jetty which existed right here. The captain was down below undertaking some tasks, and the crew were aloft furling the sails. So Jimmy, along with 7 others, took the opportunity to storm on board. One of them, we're not exactly sure who, threatened the captain with an axe as he stood over the companionway, stopping him coming up, while the other 7 lowered the boat and made ready for their escape.
A report has been brought to town by the government steamer Derwent of the seizure of the boat belonging to the Swan River packet, when lying off the Cascades probation station, Tasman's Peninsula, by 8 prisoners of the Crown. It is stated that one of the men, armed with a hatchet, stood over the companion to prevent the captain coming up, and that the crew being aloft furling sails, the 8 men all got away.
Among those 7 others, who together with Jimmy stole the boat from the Swan River packet, were 2 convicts, 2 other boys that were on the Elphinstone on its 3rd voyage. Boys that Jimmy had known since leaving England, and all for his time at Point Pure as well. And they were one Andrew Kelly and another Richard Walton. And of the 3 of them, until this series at least, it was Andrew Kelly who was actually the most famous of those 3 convicts who escaped on the day. More about him later. And while this series is called A Pirate in Chains, it wasn't for this boat theft that Jimmy got his nickname, because when all in all, after all the things that are about to happen next, they didn't end up actually getting even charged with stealing the boat. Now, I'm going to get back in the car and drive over 60 k's to the next location. Or maybe I could just steal a boat. Arr. Now, it's not known whether the boat they liberated had just oars, or whether it was also fitted with sails. But it's 15.5 nautical miles from Cascades to Carlton River, just around that point there. And nevertheless, they made it in less than a day. So if they were sailing, one would think that they could have done it in about 4 hours. So this is the Carlton River, and the 8 escapees from the Cascades would have made landfall somewhere around here, pulling up the boat to the reasonably flat shores and making their way inland. On the evening of the 9th, having made good ground from where they landed near the Carlton River, the absconders came across this premises here. Now there is a little bit of confusion about the location of this premises, but this event absolutely definitely happened because it was recorded not only in newspaper articles at the time.
William Foster, William Walker, Andrew Kelly and James Harrison were charged with robbery under arms. On the 9th of November last, Mr. Bartholomew Reardon, who resides at the White Marsh in the Pittwater district, was with his family sitting down to dinner, when the 4 prisoners, who were bolters from Port Arthur, armed with 3 axes and a bludgeon, entered the house.
But also recorded in the conduct records of the prisoners who were sentenced for this robbery. This is a property known as Green Hills on Bankton Road off Delmore Road, just in the Fawcett area. And on that evening, the 4, maybe 8 of the absconders broke into the property of one Bartholomew Reardon, who was in one count sitting down with his family having dinner, and in another count it was Mrs. Reardon. But we'll get to the bottom of that shortly. But anyway, there's also a little bit of mystery about this because the newspaper said that the Reardon's property was at White Marsh in the Pittwater district. Now there is no White Marsh anywhere near the Pittwater district. There's a White Marsh up near Runnymede, some 30 odd kilometres away. But we know that this is definitely the Reardon's property because the Reardons themselves have said so. The Hobart Town Courier reports that William Foster, William Walker, Andrew Kelly and James Harrison were charged with robbery under arms. On the 9th of November last, Mr. Bartholomew Reardon, who resides at the White Marsh in the Pittwater district, was with his family sitting down to dinner when the bolters from Port Arthur, armed with 3 axes and a bludgeon, entered the house and with imprecations demanded money and rations. 2 of them stood over the inmates while the other stole every article of value that they could lay their hands on. They dressed themselves in the best male attire they found, and nearly all the female dresses, bonnets, etc. they destroyed. Then they left, taking with them a gun, watch, knife, 3 loaves of bread, tea, sugar, meat, etc. Pretty dramatic. Now I think I may have finally uncovered the reason behind the confusion between White Marsh and the Reardon's property at Green Hills, because the Green Hills property is only 300 metres up the road from this road called White Hill Road. So maybe that's the source of the confusion. In any case, it was definitely the Reardon's property at Green Hills that Jimmy and his mates held up. Now there's a bit of dispute with the Reardon family about this event. One of the things that is disputed is that the Reardon family today believes that the homestead was actually held up by Andrew Kelly and James Dalton, 2 quite famous Tasmanian bushrangers. Through the Sorell Historical Society Facebook page, I reached out to the Reardon family to see if we could come to some understanding about the location. Was it White Marsh or was it Green Hills? And I was responded to my comment by one Judy Pearson, who's a well-known member of the Reardon family and quite a solid family historian. And she said something really interesting. She said, for example, that the family had no memory of Harrison and the others raiding their property. They knew that James Dalton and Andrew Kelly, 2 of Tasmania's most famous bushrangers, had actually held up the Reardons, and it certainly therefore couldn't have been Jimmy and his mates. And I tried to explain to her that, well, it was written up in 4 newspaper articles, it was written in the conduct records, the guys were sentenced to death for the crime of holding up the Reardon family, and it's not sort of something that would be faked. And she was adamant though that her family's memory held more sway than documented evidence in the convict records. So I went and did a little bit more research, and I found a copy of a book by Robert Cox called Baptised in Blood, the history of the Sorell district. And it said something really interesting, and I quote, "On 9 November 1849, 8 convicts reported to have included, it appears incorrectly by some, James Dalton." So the local historian has got to the bottom of the confusion, so we can be fairly certain that it wasn't James Dalton and a different Andrew Kelly.
We interrupt this program to annoy you and make things generally irritating.
So let's investigate the Andrew Kelly story, because Dad's history records that Andrew Kelly was one of the Elphinstone boys that Jimmy had come out with from the UK to Point Pure. But when you look at the convict records for the convicts from the Elphinstone, you can see that Andrew Kelly from the Elphinstone, his convict number is 6092, in line with the 6071 for Jimmy. And if you look at his conduct record, you can see it actually concludes at the end of Point Pure. So if he has no further conduct record from that, how could he possibly have been in prison later on? And then if you look a little bit further, you find another record here of Andrew Kelly 6092. And if you look at it at first glance, it seems to suggest that in July 1849, Andrew Kelly was executed. So therefore there'd be no possible way for him to have accompanied Jimmy and the others in November of that year. And in fact, the absconding records indicates that convict number 1539, Andrew Kelly, was with the group. Although, confusingly, it also says that he was from the Elphinstone. Now, it got me started thinking that maybe there were 2 Andrew Kellys and they'd got a little bit of the administrative data mixed up. But in reality, it's a lot more complex, but also a lot more simple than that. Because it seems that Andrew Kelly 6092 was in fact released after his time at Point Pure, but in July 1849 he was convicted again for stealing after he was a free man. And he was sent to the Cascades, and he was given the number 1539. It is the same person. And even more amazingly enough, when Andrew Kelly later returned to Tasmania, to Port Arthur in fact, he escaped again, this time with the infamous James Dalton. And up in the north of the state, they held up someone and actually murdered them. And for that, Andrew Kelly was executed. So Judy Pearson from the Reardon family here is correct. She was held up by the famous Andrew Kelly. Trouble is, it was Andrew Kelly with Jimmy Harrison and others, not with James Dalton.
And now back to your regularly scheduled program.
So we can be fairly certain that it wasn't James Dalton and a different Andrew Kelly in 1853 who held up the Reardons, but it was, as stated at the time, James Harrison, William Forster, etc., who held up the Reardon family. But the question now is, which Reardon did they hold up? So I'm here in Richmond, one of the most best preserved colonial towns in Australia. Behind us is the original Richmond Bridge, built in 1823. So it had been completed almost 20 years before Jimmy even arrived in the colony. So why am I here? There's no record of Jimmy spending any time in Richmond, but we're on the trail of the Reardon family, and we'll see if we can track down the man who Jimmy held up and try and answer a little question that's been bugging me for a while with the research. Now Dad's history of Jimmy says that the Reardon that he held up was Bartholomew Reardon, who was born on Norfolk Island. And Bartholomew was the son of another Bartholomew, who was a First Fleet convict and was sent to Norfolk Island and died in the early 1800s, 1807 I think. But there's a bit of a problem with this Bartholomew Reardon that Dad says Jimmy held up, because Jimmy held up the Reardons in November 1849. And we can see from this headstone that this Bartholomew died in January 1849. So he was dead and buried here well before Jimmy held up the Reardon property. So we need to search a little bit further to find out who it was that Jimmy and his mates held up down at the Pittwater district down near Fawcett. So, I think we finally found him. Bartholomew Reardon III, who was very much alive and in his early adulthood at the time when Jimmy and the others burst into the farmhouse and held up the family. Sadly, this Bartholomew Reardon III passed away in 1886 in a bushfire, aged 67 years of age. One of the natural disasters that we Tasmanians have to deal with on quite a regular basis. So yeah, Bartholomew Reardon III, son of the Bartholomew Reardon II, who was born on Norfolk Island, to Bartholomew Reardon I, a First Fleet convict. And it's really unfortunate that we couldn't get a member of the Reardon family to be prepared to be featured in this video and interviewed, and perhaps we could develop a bond between the two families 150 plus, 170 plus years later. But unfortunately, we haven't even got that. What we've actually got from the Reardon family through Judy Pearson is denial that Jimmy and his team were ever the ones to hold up the Reardon family. And it's really sad that denial is happening, because it would have been really good to connect. So if there's any members of the Reardon family who do watch this video, please reach out and hit me up a comment below, and finally maybe we can get some reconciliation between the two families. That'd be great, I reckon. What do you think? See you, Bartholomew. Apologise for James taking all your stuff, scaring you and your family. But he certainly paid for it, didn't he? On the 10th of September, James and his 3 other accomplices were here in this region. This is the Bream Creek region. It's about 15 k's as the crow flies from the Carlton River. And here on the 10th of September, they held up the property of one Thomas Howe. This wasn't to be the last property that they held up. On the 14th of September, James and his companions held up the house of Mr. G. Eagle and stole a fowling piece and some stores. And they once again took to the bush and established a little campsite here on the banks of the Carlton River, making a temporary hut, it's written. Now, unlike Reardon and the others, Eagle was going to get his stuff back, and he gathered together a party of armed settlers. And on the morning of the 15th, they surrounded the bark hut and called upon James and his companions to surrender, which apparently they did without demur. Which is sort of not like James, really, is it? Anyway, his days as an escapade, as a bushranger, were over. One of the few colonial buildings remaining in Sorell is this one at 28 Gordon Street, which was the constable's residence. And while it's not actually recorded who captured James Harrison and his party after the 8 convicts had split into 2, we do know that Constables Dean and Kay from the Sorell Police managed to capture Bradbury, Smith, Walton and Salter. Those constables would have actually lived in this building here. The Sorell jail doesn't exist anymore. In fact, not much of colonial Sorell exists, having been replaced by modern buildings. But the Sorell jail was once located here, on what is now the site of the Sorell Council. And it's not exactly colonial architecture, is it?
We interrupt this programme to annoy you and make things generally irritating.
The plough is the symbol of the Sorell district. The plough was constructed in 1901 for Mr. C.C. Madsen, also of Wattle Hill. It was donated by Mr. Hillman Madsen to the National Trust Sorell Group. Well, we're not examining all of my family's history, but suffice to say that I'm actually related to the Madsens too. My great-grandfather Jim Wright, whose daughter married Keith Harrison, is descended from the Jessens and the Madsens. And just finding this is just really sort of brings it all home.
And now back to your regularly scheduled programme.
This intersection of Murray and Macquarie Streets in Hobart is one of the most historically significant intersections in Australia, definitely in Tasmania, and one of the most historically significant intersections in the Harrison family history as well. But because before we get on to talking about what happened to James next, the St David's Cathedral behind us was where James's grandson Percy was married, and in the windows on the top floor was my office in my first ever job with the Department of Premier and Cabinet. But we're not here to talk about Percy or me, we're here to talk about James. Because after being captured and sent to the Sorell jail, James was brought over here, where existed the original Hobart jail. He was then brought in tunnels underneath Murray Street into the building behind us, which is now the Treasury building, but was the Supreme Court. And on the 6th of December 1849, only a little over 2 and a bit weeks since they were captured,
William Foster, William Walker, Andrew Kelly and James Harrison were charged with robbery under arms. His Honour briefly summed up, and the jury almost immediately returned a verdict of guilty against all 4 of the prisoners.
4 of the Port Arthur absconders were then placed at the bar: William Foster, William Walker, Andrew Kelly and James Harrison. They stood indicted for the robbery at the Reardons at the White Marsh, Pittwater, on the 9th ultimo, armed with offensive weapons. Verdict: guilty.
And for that, they were sentenced to death. The hangings were to be carried out in the Hobart Jail, which no longer exists, but this is where it was. Except on the 21st of December, the Comptroller of Convicts decided to stay their execution and commute their sentence of death to life transportation beyond the seas. They're already in Van Diemen's Land. Where the bloody hell else, where else were they going to send them? Well, they sent them to Norfolk Island. So, if you want to find out what happened on Norfolk Island, better stay tuned. Although, spoiler alert, there's already a video up about Norfolk Island. But if you've enjoyed this one, please click like, please subscribe, and make some comments below. And particularly if you're one of the Reardon family, we'd really like to get in touch. And yeah, we'll see you again somewhere in the next stage of the exciting adventure of James Jimmy Harrison, Convict 6071, a pirate in chains. Thanks for watching. The Harrison Plunkett connection continues to be a theme of these videos. And I'm not going out of my way to actually do this, it just seems to be a coincidence. So here in Richmond, we find this little colonial cottage that Sonia and I rented in early 1990. And it had just been renovated at the time. I think we were the first tenants. Let's just say the walls were very, very thin because we could hear our next door neighbour in the conjoined cottage stirring her cup of tea. So, no, sorry, I won't say any more about that.